Bueno, buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. We're going to start this hearing because the logistics are a bit complicated because we're going to have many speakers with us via video link. And that's not easy. And it's not going to be very swift necessarily either. So we're going to start. We'll begin with a very brief introduction on why we decided to hold this hearing. With all due respect for the Venezuelan authorities and institutions, they do know that this House and this subcommittee is following the human rights situation in Venezuela very closely. We're very interested and very concerned. Now, we've invited representatives of the Venezuelan authorities to participate today, but they declined. And I would just like to state that neither this House nor our committee has any intention of intervening in Venezuela in any way whatsoever. There are too many conflicts in the world to follow them all that closely, but we of course want to make sure that the rule of law is respected everywhere and that human rights are respected everywhere. And we monitor human rights throughout the world, which means that we can denounce a situation of violation of human rights anywhere in the world, and civil rights indeed as well, and that is also, of course, the case for Venezuela. When there are political actors in prison in a country, we know in this committee that this is a very bad sign, and we find that the government in Caracas has failed in respecting institutions and voters. Respect for all political parties, of all color and stripe, is the hallmark of a democratic country, and all authorities should also be respected and independent, and they should be allowed to work independently, and the rule of law should be respected in all areas and at all levels, and of course all elected positions have to be respected. Government has to make sure that all political parties, all political actors can participate, and the government cannot criminalize the actions of their political adversaries, the opposition. And this is the case, of course, in Venezuela, but this is something that applies throughout the world. We here in this House stand with the Venezuelan society, and we want to see that violence and the extreme confrontation and the political polarization we're seeing now are not the best way to come up with a solution that will benefit all Venezuelans. And in saying this, I'm not engaging in any conspiracy against Venezuela. No, I'm saying this as a friend, indeed as an advocate of Venezuela. We do feel that Venezuela's political representatives should establish a free democratic space where the rights of all to coexist and rule of law be respected. And I am speaking here, and I think that I represent the majority in this House, and call on the authorities to free the mayor of Caracas. A number of figures, very important figures throughout the world have called for this, and so have human rights movements. The detention of Leopoldo Lopez and Mr. Cevalles, the mayor of San Cristobal, were arbitrary. This has been established, and it's been decided that they should be freed, and we're calling on the Venezuelan authorities to do so, and the Organization of American States is very concerned about this. And they're saying that what has been done is not compatible with international standards. They're detained in a military prison, and we've always applied the same principle in this House. Anyone is entitled to a presumption of innocence, and nobody should be detained without due process, and nobody should be detained arbitrarily without due sentence. And of course, these actions should be taken in a reasonable time frame, and any trials should be held within a reasonable time frame, and we call on the Venezuelan authorities to take the necessary measures to make sure that they're carried out in due manner. Now, we wanted to see everyone respected in Venezuela, and we also call on everyone in Venezuela to remain calm so that there are no victims of this politically very sensitive situation. We call on Venezuela to free all political prisoners, and it may be the case that President Nicolas Maduro is indifferent to this, but we are not indifferent. Next month I will be participating in an official mission from this house, and I will try to bring this message personally to the Venezuelan authority. Nobody is entitled to interfere in the political decisions made by the government in Venezuela, and that Venezuela is free to govern itself in the way it chooses. However, we must demand respect for human rights and the rule of law, and we must carry out an impartial investigation of what we feel are violations of human rights. And today we have with us very important speakers. They're going to give us their perspective from their own point of view and from the ground of what's going on right now in Venezuela. And some of the speakers are here with us, and some will speak via video link. And we're going to try to mix them up so that we first have a video link and then somebody speaking directly here to try to make the whole hearing flow easily. And we're of course going to give you also the floor to the members first, of course, for any questions or comments they may have. So first of all, I'm going to give the floor to Mrs. Delsa Solorzano, who is a member of Par Latina, and she's the coordinator of the Commission on Human Rights from the Mesa de Unidad Democrática. Go ahead, madam.
No sé quién está tratando de hacer la conexión.
We're trying to establish a connection. Very well. Could you please try to link up? And while you do so, I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Assis, who will have to leave.
Bueno, pues mientras siguen intentando conectar.
Very well. While you try to connect with Ms. Solorzano, I'm going to give the floor to Ms. Desiree Cabrera, who's here with us, who's the representative of the Committee of Victims of La Guarimba and the Continuous Coup.
Gracias. Buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Cabrera, and I'm part of the body representing victims and attacking the continuous coup. We support victims and families of victims of the violence that occurred in Venezuela in 2013 and 2014. Luis Duran and Oscar Guerrero are with me this afternoon. They're also part of the committee. First of all, let me thank you, Madam Chairman, for the opportunity of being here in the Human Rights Subcommittee in the European Parliament to tell you precisely what's been going on in my country in the last few years, and to ask you to help justice be done for those families that have been affected by the violence. I'm not a politician. I don't represent any political organisation either. I'm just a mother whose daughter was at a party with a large number of other children under the age of 13, and it was attacked by violent groups linked to various Venezuelan politicians. We're part of the committee and have been victimised because of that twice. First of all, because some people have lost family members because of politically inspired violence. Luis Duran, who's here with me this afternoon, is one of the many victims whose son was attacked in the public and trying to put a chain across the road while he was riding his motorbicycle, and he was beheaded. Oscar Carrera has another person who's lost a hand because of an explosive device thrown by violent groups when he was trying to drive a lorry full of medicines. People, once again, who weren't involved in any kind of violent protest at all. Secondly, we have been victimized by the political use that some have made, some international organizations have made, and the media have made, social media and other types of media in our case. Honourable members of the European Parliament, when in this European Parliament people say that 43 people who were killed in Venezuela in 2014 were students and peaceful demonstrators murdered by the Maduro regime, we as victims feel highly indignant, not just because it's a huge lie and a manipulation, but mainly because we feel that our pain is being used for political gain, forgetting about the people who are the real victims here and trying to make the victimizers into heroes. The facts, ladies and gentlemen, are that 35 of these 43 people who died were killed by violent groups. Other political leaders on the 12th of February 2014 convened these groups and were putting together ambushes in the streets, firing against people who tried to bring up and put up barricades. They were trying to set fire to public buildings, trying to oblige the national government to leave office. And these violent acts led to 868 people being injured and thousands of people who found their right to health, to education, to freedom of movement, to food, greatly reduced. That's why members of the European Parliament, when this House and other democratic bodies call for the release of those arrested in the wake of these violent acts and call them political prisoners, you're really stopping our right to justice, and you're providing impunity for those who are responsible for extremely serious acts. And the fight for human rights has been completely falsified. It's only right and proper that this Parliament be aware that over above Mr. Lopez or Ceballos and other people who have been imprisoned, there is Ms. Duran, a young worker who was killed while trying to help a 7-year-old boy. Julio Gonzalez, a prosecutor from the Public Prosecutor's Office, who died in trying to dismantle a barricade, leaving 2 children behind him. Someone else shot in the face while trying to dismantle a barricade, and he left 4 orphan children. A police officer was killed with leaving behind a pregnant wife after having been shot to death. A member of the armed forces shot in the head, leaving a 1-year-old son behind, and a large number of men and women who paid the price of violent activity carried out in Venezuela last year. All of these people, these are the real victims. I wish that their names could have been mentioned in the speeches made in this European Parliament, and I hope that my Guarimba victims, fellow members who have made the long journey with me, let's hope that wish that they could have been heard from this afternoon. On behalf of my committee, we would ask you not to use human rights as a political instrument. The right to peaceful demonstration, the right to assemble, the right to freedom of expression can't be used as an excuse to justify and legitimize acts of violence and criminal acts. We shouldn't try to trick the international international community about what's really actuating the political leaders of parties when they organised the violent demonstrations in February to June last year. The real intentions, which the Venezuelans will never forget, when they listened to what Leopoldo López said, when a journalist asked him when this will end, Leopoldo López said immediately, when we've got rid of those people who are in charge. We want these acts of violence not to be covered up or passed over in silence as the media and some politicians have tried to do. Some international human rights bodies are guilty of that as well. They wanted to point to the people who are responsible of this violence as victims of state power, forgetting or distorting the testimony of the people who knew those who were killed or were injured on those days. Finally, we'd ask that what the European Parliament does in the future be aimed at stopping impunity and that the people who are really responsible for these crimes against our families be punished. In particular, we want there to be respect and solidarity with all those victims, those who have lost those near and dear to them because of the activities of those who use human rights as an excuse for carrying out violent political action. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
We now have established a video link with Ms. Delsa Solosano. I believe she can hear me. She's a member of Parlatino and she's the coordinator of the Commission on Human Rights called Mesa de Unidad Democrática. Can you hear me? Yes, you have the floor. But let us first turn down the lights, slightly dim them so that we can see the screen. My name is I'm afraid we can't hear properly. Okay. My name is...
Un momento. Tenemos un problema con el sonido y supongo que los intérpretes no pueden...
I'm sorry, we have a bit of an issue with the sound, so that it's quite difficult for the interpreters to hear the video link. Do you have a microphone, madam? Perhaps if you speak a little more closely, and let's see if the sound improves. Thank you.
18 años, cuales la característica principal ha sido la violación a todos los tipos de derechos humanos que están previstos, protegidos en todos los instrumentos internacionales de la materia. Efectivamente, ¿sí me está bien?
Hay un problema con el sonido, no la podemos traducir.
I'm afraid the sound quality isn't quite good enough. We can't even follow in Spanish because the sound cuts out continuously. Do you have a technician at hand? Perhaps you can tell him that we can't hear you well enough. And this is particularly difficult for the interpreters.
Se entrecorta la voz. Bueno, el Parlamento Europeo tiene mucho que mejorar en términos técnicos, la verdad.
Well, there are some technical improvements to be made in the European Parliament, quite clearly.
No, nos pasa todo el tiempo, con Venezuela.
It's not just something that happens today with Venezuela, it happens all the time. Very well, I'm going to give the floor then to Mr. Ramón Guillermo Aveledo, who's Secretary for Foreign Relations of the Mesa de la Unidad Democrática, because he's here with us.
Señora Presidenta.
Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen of the House, In March this year, the European Parliament issued its most recent resolution on Venezuela. This is the third one. There were two last year, one from the 27th of February and one from the 18th of December. These are only the most recent resolutions. And the European Parliament spoke again. They spoke out because of the events in our country, which in February reached a new sad peak with the detention of the mayor of Caracas, Antonio Ledesma, who was recovering from a surgery, and the hearing for his trial was suspended for the third time on Monday the 9th. Just like with the economic and social and political situation in Venezuela, we find that the human rights situation in Venezuela has taken a turn for the worst. One figure really defines this regime, and this is something was issued by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and it states that the Venezuelan government does not accept following through on decisions by international organizations of human rights, and they say that this goes against their national sovereignty. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is in fact a violation of the applicable international legislation. Because, of course, everyone is entitled to personal safety and security. And between 1999 and May 2015, more than 252,000 Venezuelans have lost their lives. We've gone from 25 murders per 100,000 inhabitants to 82, and 25 per 100,000 is already worrying. And this is carried out in impunity, and our security forces have been become militarized, and this is something that is increasing. And the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has also found that there is a growth in civil armed forces that act as paramilitary and police forces, and they control society, and this is a clear violation of international standards. This, of course, according to that commission. And the NGO Provea, which is well known internationally, in its annual report says that there has been an increase in torture in Venezuela by 137%. There are also problems with political rights in Venezuela. In April, the governor of the state of Miranda was the presidential candidate for Unidad Democrática, said that a picture of him was used for target practice in the army. And Mr. Tariq El Hassami also has declared that Enrique Capriles was of war. And here I'm going to quote one of our governors, and he has stated that a neighboring country, and perhaps the most important one, and here he was referring to the state of Aragua, is a state that is governed by counter-revolutionary forces, and we know that they will become a strategic goal in the case of an armed struggle. So for Aragua, the governor of Miranda is a strategic target in the case of a violent conflict, because his interest goes against the revolution, against those who are not patriotic, and these are the people he defends. Now, these are the words of a political authority in our country, and we've also found that other dissidents have not been allowed to participate in our democratic for example, the member of Congress, Maria Corina Machado, who was expelled arbitrarily from Parliament on orders from the President. And it was declared illegal that members of the Venezuelan parliament be elected by popular vote. And this goes against the law. And this is something that's been happening since 1998. And there's still no voting scheduled, and no elections have been called for the Assembly, and the Assembly is to meet again on the 5th of January 2016. Leopoldo Lopez, Daniel Ceballos, and other political detainees have declared a hunger strike. So what we're finding is that the judiciary is being used for political purposes. And there's also a lack of respect for the freedom of the press. And in May, a court decided that 22 leaders of national newspapers would be given a travel ban because of the information they published. And these are, of course, representatives of newspapers such as El Nacional and Tal Cual, and also the web portal lapatilla.com. And these are, of course, preventive measures, and so those accused had no means of protecting themselves, of defending themselves. And there's also a restriction now on buying foreign currency and selling foreign currency. When it comes to economic and social rights, there's no increase in the population's purchasing power. Provea says that we see inflation, shortages, a lack of jobs, social services, health services, construction services, they are all worse now than they used to be. The inflation that's been accumulated on foodstuffs over the last 12 years is almost 4,000%. And the conclusion of an independent UN committee on this matters has stated that the Venezuelan food system is no longer capable of meeting the objectives of food security and food sovereignty. And as for the ILO, well, the Venezuelan government is violating Convention number 87 and 26 and 144 on trade union rights. On behalf of the people of Venezuela, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Vamos a ver si conseguimos.
Thanks very much indeed. Let's try again with Mrs. Solorzano. Thank you very much. I'm National Vice President of the...
Y coordinadora.
Sorry, the sound's gone again.
De la Mesa de la Unidad Democrática. En nuestro país, como les decíamos, hay una grave crisis en materia de derechos humanos que se evidencia en la violación de todos los derechos previstos en cada uno de los instrumentos internacionales de la materia. Vamos a hacer un breve esbozo de lo que hoy ocurre en mi país. La Mesa de la Unidad Democrática, para que sepan a quienes representamos,
un momento de nuevo,
una
señora
plataforma...
Solórzano.
Sorry, once again, it's not possible for the interpreters to do this.
En español se entiende muy bien.
We can hear you in Spanish, but there's too much interference, I'm afraid, for the interpreters to be able to do it.
Entonces, ¿puede interpretar? Sí. De acuerdo. Adelante. Adelante. Lo siento, es muy complicado.
Do apologise. Try and speak a bit more slowly, perhaps.
Sí, adelante, adelante.
Yeah, go on. Go ahead.
La Mesa de la Unidad Democrática es una plataforma que agrupa a 18 partidos políticos, todos a esa alianza que lucha por la libertad y la democracia en Venezuela, por los caminos democráticos, representamos hoy. Es de destacar que desde el día 12 de febrero del año 2014, la comisión que dirijo ha registrado un total de 3.167 ciudadanos detenidos por razones políticas. De este número, solamente 709 ciudadanos han obtenido libertad plena. 2.383 permanecen con medidas cautelares, es decir, permanecen sometidos a algún tipo de privación de sus libertades ciudadanas a causa de la judicialización de la función política en Venezuela. 14 ciudadanos se mantienen bajo arresto domiciliario. 32 personas aún siguen privadas de su libertad, más 11 ciudadanos que están privados de su libertad desde el año 2002. Eso da una cifra global de más de 80 presos políticos hoy en Venezuela. Pero este no es el único tipo de persecución política que hoy vivimos. También hoy en Venezuela hay exiliados políticos. Ejemplos claros: Manuel Rosales, líder fundador de Un Nuevo Tiempo, quien fuera candidato presidencial en el año 2006 contra Hugo Chávez. Este activó una operación que se llamó Manuel Rosales vas preso, y la consecuencia es que una orden del Ejecutivo Nacional fue cumplida y hoy Manuel Rosales tiene más de 6 años en el exilio. Líderes de Voluntad Popular de data más reciente, como Carlos Vecchio, también se encuentran en el exilio político debido a la crisis de derechos humanos que hoy atraviesa nuestra Venezuela. Destacan entre nuestros presos políticos líderes como Antonio Ledesma o como Daniel Ceballos, pero hay otros ciudadanos presos que hoy, por cierto, también se encuentran en huelga de hambre. Los estudiantes Alexander Tirado y Raúl Emilio Baduel, cuyo único delito fue, uno, portar una bandera de Venezuela y el otro, acompañarlo con una cruz que tenía el nombre de todos los muertos, porque a quienes nos duelen los muertos de la patria no distinguimos el color político de ellos. 43 fallecidos de manos de una violencia en las calles instaurada sin duda alguna desde un Estado opresor y violento. Adicionalmente, en nuestro país, la violación a la libertad de expresión y a la libertad de prensa se inicia en el propio año 2007, cuando se impone una política denominada hegemonía comunicacional. Ello ocurrió con el cierre de Radio Caracas Televisión, la televisora más antigua de Venezuela, y se ha venido dando continuidad hoy día cuando vemos que el Estado tiene el monopolio del suministro del papel para los periódicos en Venezuela, y adicionalmente podemos decir que los pocos medios libres que aún quedan hoy en el país son perseguidos brutalmente por la justicia politizada venezolana. Si nos ceñimos a otro tipo de derechos, como los derechos económicos o el derecho a la alimentación, sabemos bien que el modelo económico instrumentado durante los últimos 16 años comprendió desde sus inicios la expropiación de haciendas, industrias y comercios para ser estatizados, diezmando su capacidad productiva por una incapacidad gigantesca y una corrupción que abruma notablemente a Venezuela. Hoy podemos decir, por un solo ejemplo, que el 100% del café que produce Venezuela lo procesa el Estado, y cuando usted lo busca en los supermercados o abastos, simplemente no existe. El desabastecimiento es absoluto. El 100% de la distribución de alimentos en Venezuela, 100%, óigase bien, es controlado por el Estado. Y a pesar de ello, la escasez de los productos en altísimos porcentajes en la totalidad de los abastos y supermercados es atribuida a un supuesto acaparamiento o a una supuesta guerra económica. Si hablamos del tema de impunidad, anualmente el Ministerio Público de Venezuela entrega un informe anual, del cual nosotros realizamos tradicionalmente un concienzudo análisis. Podemos decir hoy que con cifras oficiales la impunidad alcanza la lamentable cifra de 98.76%. Esto quiere decir que solamente menos del 2% de los delitos que se cometen llega finalmente a una sanción o a un juicio. Ello es gravísimo en un país donde debemos decir que lamentablemente hoy, según cifras oficiales de Naciones Unidas, nos hemos convertido en el país con mayor índice de homicidios en el mundo, porque Honduras, quien tenía este lugar nada honroso, ha logrado descender su índice de homicidios por 100.000 habitantes a 69 homicidios por 100.000. Hoy Venezuela tiene la cifra de 82 homicidios por cada 100.000 habitantes. Ello en un marco donde no existen políticas verdaderas de seguridad ciudadana, donde la seguridad ciudadana ha sido completamente militarizada. Y podemos decir que casi la totalidad de los ministros de Interior y Justicia, que son los encargados de la seguridad ciudadana en Venezuela, en los últimos años han sido militares. La militarización de la seguridad ciudadana ha sido observada y criticada en reiteradas oportunidades por la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos y, sin embargo, esto ha sido simplemente omitido por el Estado a la hora de establecer políticas. Y lamentablemente decimos esto porque estas políticas son completamente inexistentes. Para concluir en esta materia, quisiéramos hacer una breve referencia a una resolución peligrosísima, la resolución número 008610, emanada del Ministerio de la Defensa, bajo la cual se permite a los cuerpos armados del Estado, a la Fuerza Armada Nacional, que estén en las calles de Venezuela, reprimiendo a los manifestantes con la utilización de armas potencialmente violentas. Esto lo dice de modo textual esta terrible resolución, contra la cual hemos recurrido ante el Tribunal Supremo de Justicia y hasta la fecha, a pesar de que fue hecha nuestra denuncia en febrero pasado, no hemos obtenido respuesta. Vemos, pues, una grave situación en materia de derechos humanos en nuestro país, donde no escapa nadie. Así como no se debe distinguir a la hora de defender los derechos humanos, tampoco se distingue en Venezuela a la hora de violarlos. Mi más profundo agradecimiento a los europarlamentarios por permitir que esta discusión hoy se eleve ante ustedes. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias. Muchísimas gracias.
Thanks very much indeed. I do apologise with the sound about the sound problems there. I didn't have a problem because I was listening to you directly. And I think if there isn't interpretation available, it's going to be difficult to... So the only people who will understand are people who understand the original language. But let's try again. Let's try making the next connection and see if the quality is good enough for the interpreter to do it. Otherwise, I might have to stop this aspect of the hearing. Alfredo Romero, who's director of the Venezuelan Penal Forum.
No, si no consigo la interpretación voy a cancelarlo, porque los diputados que no entienden español no tienen la culpa.
Así es.
Sí, hola. Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon.
¿Le llega bien mi voz?
Can you hear me okay?
Sí.
Bueno, pues cuando quiera puede usted comenzar. Vamos a ver si conseguimos.
So you can start and let's see if the sound quality is good enough to allow the interpreters to do it. Well, actually, I'm going to do it in English anyway, so make it easier.
Vamos a ver,
porque entiendo el problema.
No sé cuál era el problema. Inténtelo. Sí, vamos a ver.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much to the European Parliament in order to receive or the Venezuelan situation, to receive all the Venezuelan nationals also in there in the Parliament and through video. Sorry. It's just
okay.
One thing. It's impossible to talk with the. I'm listening the translation.
But you can. Pero se puede quitar quítese el auricular para.
Well, just take your headphones off.
Y luego se lo pone. Es que esto lo muy...
And you can put it on afterwards.
I'm the executive director of Foro Penal Venezolano, which is an organization that represents victims of arbitrary detention in Venezuela. Foro Penal Venezolano is an organization with more than 200 lawyers all around the country and more than 1,500 activists in Venezuela. I would like to begin with showing a case in order to exemplify the current human rights situation in Venezuela. This is the case of Gerardo Carrero. Gerardo Carrero was detained on May 8, 2014 with other 230 young people. Ironically, they were demonstrating for the release of students jailed because of demonstrations. They were pacifically demonstrating in a tent camp they placed before the United Nations office in Caracas. When in jail at the Helicoide, which is a Bolivarian intelligence police prison in Caracas, Gerardo denounced he was tortured, specifically on August 2014. He said that 7 officers grabbed his wrist in a with the newspaper to avoid bruising, and then handcuffed him to a tube in the ceiling and hung him from that tube where he remained suspended like a piñata for 12 hours. He was lashed out behind his knees with sticks and wooden boards, which ended broken when hitting against his body, leaving bruises on his legs and arms. Besides that, he had severe abdominal pain, etc. We as lawyers actually went to the General Prosecutor Office to denounce this situation and actually use international media. And we expected that Gerardo Carrero was going to be transferred or taken out of the Sedin location, so the Sedin prison. But instead, and surprisingly, Gerardo was transferred for 6 months to a very cold, isolated cell with no windows at the same Sedin headquarters building in Caracas. He didn't have contact with people, no contact with lawyers. Visits were not allowed. He was inside his cell for 24 hours, no sunlight. This prison is called the Tomb. It is located 5 stories beneath the headquarters building. There are just 7 cells. There are still people there. There is no notion of time, no watches. Actually, precautionary measures in favor of Gerardo Carrero, calling for releasing him and actually calling for medical attention, for providing medical attention. Actually, on February 2015, after 6 months, as I said, Gerardo was transferred back to the Helicoide, the same place where he denounced he was tortured. However, at this time, Gerardo is still at the Helicoide. He hasn't received medical attention until now. He still suffers from stomach problems. He had more than 10 skin abscesses. And actually, just an example, just to understand, his tooth fell out and he must glue it back, crazy glue, with a fast-drying glue by himself because he didn't have medical attention at all. Many medical procedures in Venezuela remain in the same situation. To tell about arbitrary detentions, just Foro Penal Venezolano assisted till now, on this date, 200,600 detainees, just as a result of demonstrations. We have registered 3,758 detentions. Sorry?
Perdone, ahora hay un problema de nuevo.
Sorry. The sound quality deteriorated again. So, obviously, more people understand English, but it's going to be difficult to interpret what you say now. Go on in English or Spanish, as you wish.
There are we have registered 3,758 detentions from 2014. In total, 296 people has been taken to jail by judicial orders. It means between 40 days to 1 year. At this moment, there are 31 people in jail because of demonstrations, just because of demonstrations, and we have registered 77 people, 77 political prisoners. That includes, of course, the emblematic cases as Leopoldo Lopez and Daniel Ceballos, but there are 12 students in jail. There are cases not related to demonstrations. For example, the case of Inés González, jailed because issuing supposedly offensive Twitter messages against public officers. And just to conclude, maybe because of the time, I'm just going to tell you some characteristics of imprisonment, which are common to political prisoners. One is isolation in many cases. There is a case of Leopoldo Lopez, again, Daniel Ceballos, and those at the top, and many others. Visits are totally restricted just to families, direct families and lawyers, and just at a specific days. Some visits are totally restricted. Delay of judicial process and unjustified suspension of hearings, it's common. There is the case, for example, of a lawyer, a human rights lawyer, Marcelo Croato, who was 10 years behind bars, 10 months behind bars in a very dangerous jail. He's more than 1 year in jail because he's still under house arrest, and there is not even a preliminary hearing. And the preliminary hearing hasn't finished. I mean, the hearing, in order to know if the process will begin, hasn't ended at this time. There is the using of the state media in order by public officials for discrediting and criminalizing political prisoners. It's regular. There is regular surveillance through spy cameras and microphones, and actually these videos and recordings actually taken to the prisoners in jail are shown in the state media regularly, like nothing happened. I will finish. I have many things also to talk about, but I know the time is not enough. I mean, for all the information. We have registered more than 138 cases of torture, which is a very big problem. There are not investigations regarding these cases this time. And talking about killings, it is important because it's been very public officials actually changed information in some way. There have been 36 killings.
Señor Romero, no, tiene que ir concluyendo.
Those killings for demonstrations are a result of human rights violations. 7 military officers have been killed, and 7 people that actually have collisions with barricades as an accident has been also killed. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and as I always say, the human rights is universal and cannot be neutral. So thank you very much for having this opportunity to talk about the Venezuelan situation.
Muchísimas gracias, señor Romero. Siento la...
Thanks, Mr. Romero. There were some technical problems, but your message was indeed conveyed successfully. I'm now going to turn to our final speaker. Another video link. This isn't actually working all that wonderfully, I think one has to say. But since he made the effort to come along, I'll try and give the floor to Mr. Marino Alvarado, who's part of Provea, the Venezuelan Program for Education Action in Human Rights. Let's see if we can get some connection with Mr. Alvarado.
Hola.
Hola.
Hola. ¿Me oye?
Can you hear me?
Perfectamente.
Yeah, I can hear you very well.
Un poquito más fuerte, más alto.
You are going to have to speak up a bit, Mr. Alvarado, if we are going to get your comments interpreted into the various working languages of the meeting. But please go ahead whenever you're ready, sir.
Marino Alvarado.
My name is Marino Alvarado. I'm a human rights activist from Provea, the Human Rights Action. And thanks very much for this opportunity to speak to you this afternoon. I can see Ms. Cabrera, who's from the Victims of Guarimba Committee, who I can see in the room. Let me begin by saying that not everything is completely negative as far as the human rights picture in Venezuela is concerned. There are some positive aspects. For example, education. There's a significant social inclusion program that's being implemented. We've had a doubling of the number of students at university over the last few years. There's been land redistribution as far as farmers are concerned, and human rights organisation, as a human rights organisation, Provea has paid tribute to the advances that have been made in some rights management under the presidency of Hugo Chavez. As far as poverty is concerned, for example, until 2012, poverty was reduced year on year. That's a very important human rights element, of course, because it means more inclusion, more democracy. But nevertheless, we're concerned that in the first year of President Maduro's term of office, poverty went up by 6% in 2013. And all of the socio-economic indicators seem to be saying that it went up in 2014 as well. And that's serious as far as human rights is concerned, and all Venezuelans and the international community that are interested in Venezuela having more social justice and more democracy should be very concerned about that. Socio-economic problems which Venezuela has been living through in the last few years have led to considerable amounts of social discontent being generated, particularly in the poorest areas of society. And this discontent has shown itself in a spiralling protest movement, closing off streets, blocking traffic in the name of protest. Now, people might wonder why workers in Venezuela have been at the head of these protests in the last 5 years. These social protests calling for the exercise of rights and speaking out against the government weren't necessarily regarded as being democratic by the government. They was criminalised, and lots of social protest was regarded as being political, even though it was simply people calling for their rights. And there were court cases levied, and in fact 3,000 social leaders have been put on trial simply for protesting, and 150 of those were trade unionists. And about 5,000 people have been tried for being part of the protest movement. So we've got criminalisation of social leaders, and also human rights defenders have been criminalised too. The attempt, of course, being to intimidate activists. They haven't managed to achieve that, and they won't achieve it either. For example, international cooperation, perfectly legitimate, has been attacked by the government. They've unhappy about the assistance that many human rights organisations have been receiving from the European Union and cooperation to assist victims and strengthen democracy. They try to draw a link between the receipt of funds and plans to interfere in Venezuelan affairs. They say that people who are protesting about human rights are traitors to the fatherland. They use state resources to attack the human rights protesters. They're not simply reduced, they're not simply the subjects of criminal cases and ill treatment, but they're also followed and spied upon by the government as well. The government. But the government is using public resources to try to paint these people and to throw doubt on the work that they've been carrying out as human rights defenders. And don't forget, the victims of human rights abuses are often among the poorest people in the country. The government in Venezuela is carrying out a state policy to denigrate international human rights bodies. The Inter-American Human Rights Commission, for example, has been denigrated by them, and the Human Rights Forum and various other UN fora as well. The government simply doesn't tolerate criticism. It doesn't implement recommendations. It doesn't comply with the Inter-American Human Rights Court rulings. It constantly violates international human rights conventions, and says that any time there's a ruling against it in a international forum, that is an attack on the government, an attack on Venezuelan sovereignty. So they say that human rights defenders are simply part of a massive conspiracy to undermine the government. All they're doing is making recommendations, trying to ensure that Venezuela be more democratic and that human rights there be respected. The lack of independence of the public power means that citizens are basically defenceless against the state. And you can't, of course, complain against the public authorities' failure to do their job properly. And there's often politically based discrimination as far as the provision of services are concerned. And the Ombudsman basically spends her time, as her predecessor did, talking down the work of various NGOs on the subject of human rights. The prosecutorial system hasn't been properly integrated and is responsible for the high levels of impunity which exist, which in fact is up as high as 98% in Venezuela now. There are large numbers of political prisoners in Venezuela, and they are victims of the politicised justice system which we have, a system which doesn't guarantee a right to a fair trial, and is basically a machinery to generate injustice and to imprison social leaders and opponents of the government. You're going to have to come to an end, says the Chairman, because we do have large numbers of other people who want to speak. I was nearly finished, Madam Chairman, says the Speaker. I'd like to say a few things about people who have been imprisoned and the prison system in Venezuela. Prisons in Venezuela are among the most violent in the whole world. Nevertheless, in the last couple of years, I have to say that efforts have been made to try and address the problem of prison violence. Nevertheless, the number of people who die in prison is extremely high. In 2014, honourable members of the European Parliament in Venezuelan prisons, 309 murders occurred, and between 1999 and 2014, 6,472 murders have been carried out. Violations of human rights are just ongoing. So, honourable members of the European Parliament, thank you very much for having given me this chance to speak on behalf of the victims, and I'd like to pay tribute to the representative of the victims of Guatemala and people who are working to try to protect human rights and the relatives of victims of violent death in Venezuela. Thanks very much, Mr. Alvarado. Thank you very much for the effort that you've been putting in Venezuela. Let's move on to questions and comments by MEPs. I'll keep the dialogue going with the colleagues who are actually here, but we can't carry on with the video link because the connection isn't very good. We can hear you okay, but having a question and answer session will be a bit difficult. So what we'll do now is hear from various political group representatives, and we'll start with MEPs who are directly linked in their work with Venezuela. So the chairman of Mercosur, Mr. Assis, Mr. Jauregui, chairman of Eurolat, and then Luis de Grandes Pascual, who is chairman of the delegation for the Andean community. Mr. Assis, first of all. Thanks, Madam Chairman. Let me begin by paying tribute to you for having had this idea. The Subcommittee on Human Rights has as a key task making certain that human rights are respected throughout the world. And those which are culturally and historically and politically closer to us deserve our special attention. So it's not at all an attempt illegitimately to interfere in the affairs of a sovereign state, as Venezuela, of course, is. That's not why we're doing this. It's simply carried out with a attitude of profound respect to Venezuela and a country which has had a very long democratic history. But we're here to talk about human rights, so I won't make any observations about other aspects of the Maduro government, because that could be construed as interference. Those are issues which have to be sorted out by Venezuelans themselves. People have their own opinion, derived from their own political position, but we're talking here about something very different, a key issue, which at the moment is whether we are not seeing fundamental violations of the rule of law in Venezuela. I don't think you can talk about democracy without a rule of law. You can't talk, in my opinion, about democracy without a liberal component as far as cultural and political aspects are concerned. And that's the issue I'd like to raise this afternoon. I would like to express my full solidarity with the victims of violence in Venezuela. We're not drawing any distinction at all between the political origins or the motivations of the victims. If you are a victim of violence, you deserve our full solidarity. The question is whether, I said, the government in Venezuela is able to carry out a fair and rigorous and independent organisation into these situations which have led to these people losing their lives. And I have to say, unfortunately, that I have my doubts, profound doubts about it. I have doubts because in so many cases we are seeing the lack of a key element of the rule of law, the separation of powers. That's vital if a legal system is going to be independent and fair. As far as we are concerned, the legal authorities haven't behaved in the independent way which they would behave in a situation where there was a genuine rule of law. There are fundamental principles of freedom, freedom of association, freedom of information, freedom of expression. But we've heard about situations this afternoon, and these were in fact from people with different political backgrounds and political views, which makes one feel that these principles of information, to express one's views and to assemble, have not been respected in Venezuela. The final point is that I fear that today we are seeing in Venezuela criminalisation of those who hold a different opinion to the government. They are then called dissidents and then they are called criminals. That's not acceptable in a democracy. And even if we are going to see free, fair elections, no result in those elections can justify behaviour such as that. You can't simply disenfranchise effectively minorities, particularly if one's in this sort of situation. I've spoken for some time and I don't want to go on much longer, Madam Chairman. I'd like to say that I have never had a problem with the Venezuelan ambassador or the Venezuelan counterparts that we've talked with, but it's been impossible to get in touch with Venezuelan diplomats for a month now. That's not my fault, but we're simply not being able to speak to them, and one can't help wondering why that's the case. But our concern is for human rights. We have the absolute utmost respect for Venezuela, for its people, for its history, and it's in the name of that respect and rejecting any accusations of neo-colonialism or interference in their internal affairs, which we've never done in this European Parliament. That's why we're talking about human rights in this country that's so dear to us, Venezuela, today. And although I'm Portuguese, I can say that there's an enormous Portuguese community in Venezuela, so I do feel a personal stake in this and an interest in the situation in Venezuela. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Assis. Mr. Jauregui. Thank you, Chair. First of all, I would also like to congratulate you on organizing this hearing, and I would also like to express my sympathy with all the victims of this general privation of freedom. First of all, I would like to comment that at the recent Eurolat summit, we've discussed this issue on many occasions with our Latin American counterparts. And we've been quite divided on this topic. Most of our Latin American partners feel that the European view on Latin America, on what's happening in Venezuela, is an expression of a certain interference, and of course they don't think we have a right to interfere. But we, as members of this House, have repeated a notion, and I want the Venezuelan people to know this. We often discuss what's happening outside our borders in many different corners of the world. This is something we do normally. We speak of Venezuela, many other places, and when we discuss what's going on in these areas, when we feel that human rights may have been violated. So it's not a matter of interference, it's an act of solidarity. And we often say that the EU is treating migrants miserably when we are rejecting them at our borders when they come across our borders. We discuss that openly here in this House, and just like we discuss that, we also discuss what's happening elsewhere, because human rights are universal, human dignity is universal, and we must address issues when they are violated anywhere in the world. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have great respect for Venezuela and also great affection. It's a country I'm very, very fond of. And in terms of political ideology, I'm on the left wing, I'm a socialist, and I'm sorry, I don't quite understand how parts of the European left wing parties, movements are closing their eyes to a situation in which human rights are violated. I'm sure we'll be discussing this here later on. I don't understand that. I sometimes find that the members of this House sort of polarize human rights. They're divided in two, and we shouldn't do that. I know elements of the European left that are very, very critical vis-à-vis the governments of Colombia and Mexico, for example, because of what's happening there, and things are happening there. But then, when the political stripe of the government is a more left-leaning one, then suddenly they go blind and mute. But I am a socialist. But as a socialist, I also defend human rights. And I cannot stand for people who criticize certain governments because they are of a certain political conviction, but not others because they are allegedly left-leaning governments. That is unacceptable. In this House, we have to be able to speak objectively, particularly on human rights. And if you will allow me, I would like to talk about something that's out of the history of my political party, the Socialist Party of Workers in Spain. A leader of our party traveled to Moscow because he wanted to know, he wanted to see whether the revolution that had occurred in Russia was one that could connect with Spain. His name was Fernando de los Rios. And history books tell us that Fernando de los Rios asked Lenin whether the communist regime he was leading defended freedom. And Lenin allegedly replied, "Freedom for what?" And then Fernando de los Rios replied, "Freedom to be free." And I cannot understand that any left-leaning government, and it can be late President Hugo Chavez and current President Nicolás Maduro, they say they are. I cannot understand that they restrict freedom. It doesn't matter whether you're on the left of the political spectrum. You cannot curb people's freedoms. And ladies and gentlemen, in all honesty, what's been happening of late in Venezuela is a situation that is seriously undermining democracy. That is the risk, that democracy be totally undermined. And in order to help Venezuela, well, we have to defend democracy, defend freedom, defend human rights. And we have to do this from the left. And we have to do this from a position of friendship with Venezuela. I want to see elections in Venezuela, free and fair elections, without any political detainees. Peaceful elections, without violation on any side. And this includes the opposition. The people must be allowed to speak, and democracy must be imposed. And I, as president of Eurolat, that is my message. Freedom and human rights must be defended everywhere, regardless of political convictions, ideological convictions. We must always defend democracy and human rights. Without democracy and human rights, well, there is no left-wing ideology, and the left here cannot close its eyes. We cannot stand idly by, because this whole idea of a continued coup in Venezuela and a revolution, I mean, nobody believes it anymore. Let's cut out the lies. Mr. Cabello met in Haiti with the Foreign Secretary of the US. There is no coup, there is no complot. Why would they meet if there were one? And the European left must defend freedom and democracy. And I say this on behalf of European socialism. This is what we fight for.
Presidente.
Thank you very much. And there are people who are applauding you in silence, but they're here. Mr. De Grandes.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta. Yo no he aplaudido ni
I didn't applaud publicly or quietly, but I can say that I did identify with some of the comments that he said. I'm not going to speak, obviously, on behalf of the left, but I do want to say that I do agree with the words which you used to introduce the debate. I think they've set the context very, very accurately. This committee, or no committee in the European Parliament, would ever make any value judgments about Venezuela or the Venezuelan or Maduro government, particularly Venezuela. I think Parliament has been very clear, unambiguous, while being respectful. We put our ideas forward, we don't mince our words, and we condemn behaviour which deserves condemnation. And we feel that this is not conduct that's becoming to a democratic regime, but is more like a dictatorship. Obviously, we call for democracy because we're looking at things objectively. We're looking at things truthfully. We love Venezuela, particularly, of course, if one's Spanish. One has not just a debt to Venezuela, one has a certain amount of love for the country, and that's fully understandable, because we weren't simply there, but we want to give back many of the things that Venezuela has given to us. And Mr. Bellido knows that I've got a large number of my ideas from Venezuelan thought. Sometime in the past in Spain, of course, there was no freedom, and Venezuela was exemplary as far as the exercise of freedom is concerned. So why did I talk about Mr. Jauregui, and he wasn't certain about whether Parliament really had a right to speak out here? Remember what was said in the plenary, where it was said that the European Parliament, in the light of what was happening, not simply could speak, but had to speak, and had to be clear when it spoke. We need to back the legal aspects of all of this. Article 3 of the treaty says that in its relations with the rest of the world, the European Union will promote its values and interests and contribute to the protection of citizens, contribute to the protection of human rights, as well as strict respect and development of international law, in particular the principles of the UN Charter. I think there's no misunderstanding here, that we do have a legitimate right to express our opinion, and not just that, we have a duty to do so. And the evidence we've heard today and the things we've learned from other fora show that the Maduro government is trampling human rights. It's imprisoning its opponents. And one can strongly suspect that it's coming out with excuses instead of convening elections when it should have convened them already in January. So, Mr. Abeledo, this is a fundamental point. Let's stop seeing excuses from the Maduro side, pretending that the political climate isn't propitious for elections, when it's simply because he's afraid that he'll lose. And it's clear that the people of Venezuela don't want things to continue. Ramon said this, and we're saying it in the CDs, and the Liberals are saying it. There's a total agreement in the diagnosis, and there's no failure to understand what's going on. We need to speak out. We need to denounce anti-democratic behaviour and say to Mr. Maduro that he might have been legitimately elected in the first place, but he's not continuing to behave in a legitimate way. He's not behaving like a democratic governor, but like a totalitarian governor. And that's what this European Parliament needs to help stop. Working with the people of Venezuela so that they can get their freedom back. And they can get them back through the ballot box by electing people who are close to them and people who should not be imprisoned. We all agree with what's happening. We're all quite calm. We all know what the situation is, what the background is. We know what we're allowed to do under the treaties and what we're obliged to do under the treaties. Defend human rights, that's what this committee is all about. And we do that irrespective of our ideological position. And it's rare that Parliament agrees so completely as it does on this. Thank you, Mr. de Grandes. Now, Mrs. Becerra, the Vice Chairman.
I'll do this very briefly because we don't have a lot of time. I just wanted to express my deep agreement with what Mr. de Grandes and Mr. Jauregui have both said. And I think it is very significant that we agree, particularly on saying that we have to judge everyone in the same way. When we talk about human rights, it doesn't matter whether it's Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, or Burundi, or wherever. We should take a stance. We should speak out, and we should speak out for the victims of these violations. And it is clear, I think, today here that the victims are our first and foremost concern. And so we must make good use of all instruments available to us to defend those victims. And I would like to thank everyone who's spoken here today for their courage and for their continuous work, because they're not just here with us today. They're there. They were there, they are there, and they will be there. And they're working, of course, for Venezuela to be a safer country. Thank you. And thank you very much. I have 4 or 5 other speakers on my list, and then I would like for our guests to reply before they leave, and I'll extend the session by a little. So, Mr. Henkel, go ahead.
Leider ist das was.
Well, unfortunately, what is happening in Venezuela.
Now in Venezuela is unfortunately also typical for some other South American countries. I think of 50 years of suppression or more than that in Cuba and so on. We have had here in this European Parliament a debate some weeks ago on some very unsatisfactory trends in Hungary. And it was for me quite encouraging to see that other state presidents and heads of governments started to voice their concern about what happened in Hungary, what I am missing in South America. And I think we should make this also clear to other governments. What I'm missing in South America are the same kind of criticisms by, let's say, the Chilean government or the Brazilian government when it gets to criticizing Venezuela. That really is surprising and, in my view, very discouraging. And I think we should take also the opportunity when we meet people from other democratic South American governments, we should encourage them themselves to criticize Venezuela. We should not leave it to the European Parliament or European governments to criticize human rights violations in that country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Señora Weber.
Mrs. Weber.
Gracias, presidente. Yo también quiero felicitar la.
Thanks very much. I'd like to say how pleased I am that we're having this meeting. It's important that we do discuss Venezuela. I'm speaking from, or if you like, wearing an old hat. Before I became a politician, I'd spent 20 years working in NGOs back home and internationally. And I can say that the idea of the Guarimba victims and the continuous coup, I'm not sure how that can just be regarded as an NGO, because the name is a highly political organisation. The name indicates a highly political organisation. And I think that obviously it's a great pity that there are victims on all sides when violence occurs, and particularly innocent victims. But with all respect, Ms. Carrera, I wasn't really won over by what you said, because you're basically working, I think, for the Venezuelan government. I worked, as I say, for 20 years in NGOs, and I never worked for any government. And that shouldn't be the role of an NGO in a country. But I do have a question. It's a great pity that in Europe we couldn't get a joint declaration together. And what sort of Latin American solidarity exists in civil society? Do they understand what the organisations are doing in Venezuela? Do they support it? Journalists, etc. Because at the moment, at international level, there is a great deal of interest in what's happening in Venezuela, but I can't understand, or can't believe, in fact, really, that there's no interest, no corresponding interest in Latin America. Mr. Corso.
Bueno, yo voy a hacer el casi, porque el señor de...
Thank you very much, Chair. Ms. De Grande was quite absolutist when he spoke, and I'm going to introduce the maybe, and the maybe is always important in politics. I mean, I'm going to talk about representation. We have an NGO probably funded from the US and an NGO linked to the opposition party, and we have a woman from an opposition political organization, and then we have the person who was the chair of MUD up until 2004, somebody who was the face of the opposition for 6 years of that Democratic Unity Roundtable. So I don't think it's a quite balanced to only have one single representative of victims. Now, Mr. Acevedo talked about the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, which is headquartered in Washington. This organization, when it was expelled from Cuba, met in Pinochet's Chile. And we know that Pinochet murdered more than 4,000 people. And it's curious that the same standards don't apply to everyone. I mean, the US doesn't accept any of the rulings issued by the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. So do we hold everyone to the same standards? Now, Mr. Hardige, I agree with you. People are not judged by the same standards. 7 human rights resolutions on Venezuela in recent years here. I mean, if we compare that to other countries in the region, there is no comparison. There are free elections. One of them was lost. And the previous president accepted that. And it's quite curious, you don't accept this whole issue of a coup. And yes, it's a shame that no agreement was reached in Eurolat between the two co-presidents. Particularly, and this happened, however, because the Latin Americans did not accept any interference. Isn't that curious? I mean, we're talking about violence, but why don't former presidents go to Honduras? Honduras is the most violent country in the world. There are 81 journalists have been murdered in Mexico and 56 in Honduras. Much fewer than that in Venezuela. So it's not the same. Journalists Without Borders have talked about it. Why don't we talk about violence in Colombia, in El Salvador, in Honduras? You don't speak out against the democratically elected governments there. You don't talk about the economic situation there. When a government is left-leaning, you always say that the regime fails. I mean, if we look at Venezuela, from 1999, poverty has fallen from 42 to 26%. And extreme poverty, which is the worst, of course, and this was requested by FAO. It was 16% in 94 and 7% in 2011, and back in 94 you were freed to be poor. And the ratio of doctors has gone up from 20 per 10,000 to 80 per 10,000 in Venezuela recently. So that, once again, there you have those double standards. You don't talk about that in other countries. And in Mexico, 90% of impunity, more than 40,000 disappeared in Mexico. 43 students recently disappeared in Mexico. They were murdered, they were tortured, and it was the government, I'm convinced, that was behind that. And the US, the National Guard. The National Guard, ladies and gentlemen, it's a militarized body. And they go out with Humvees, and they use military equipment. You've seen it yourselves. And we don't speak out against that in the US. If the Americans can do that, why not the Venezuelans? And, you know, if you have protests in Venezuela where people are violent, they use grenades, they use other types of weapons, would you accept that in my country? Would we accept that? Would we allow people to protest with such weapons? No, ladies and gentlemen, this would not be allowed in my country. And with this I conclude, Chair. Let's talk about the detainees, because of course the figures are terrible. 43 people were murdered, 8 of them by police agents. The government's saying this. 35 because of opposition violence. 9 police officers. The 9 people who were serving the Venezuelan people. And investigations against public officers. 215 conclusive acts, 13 were accusations. 184 open cases, 29 cases are still open. These are investigations against state officers. Now, 2 for murder, 3 ill treatment. 5 from Merida, 3 from the state of Managua, 1 from Falcone. And for murder, 7 officers of the Bolivarian Guard, including the murderer who killed a 14-year-old boy. These people are brought to justice. They demonstrate that the judiciary is working. But, you know, everything's twisted and we all think that it's all impunity if that's not taken into account. Thank you.
Well, all of the people invited here deserve our respect from those who listen to them, and they shouldn't have any accusations levelled at them. But let me tell you how we got the panel together today, because that's my duty. It's the political groups who propose names for participants. Ms. Solórzano was proposed by the Social Group, Ms. Cabrera by your group, Mr. Coso, Mr. Romero from the Liberals, Mr. Abeledo from the EPP, and Mr. Alvarado, to whom we spoke through video link from the Greens. So all the political groups had proposals. We checked into the kind of organisations that they were, and then they were invited. As far as I'm concerned, I made sure that the Venezuelan embassy was informed in due time and invited to participate. I really tried very hard in the last few days to get the embassy to take part in the meeting. Tried to get in touch with the ambassador. I didn't do it, didn't succeed. The only ambassador I've not managed to speak to in my career. But the Venezuelan embassy was invited to take part and thought it wasn't appropriate for them to do so. Perhaps if they'd been here, you might have thought it was more balanced. I agree. That's why I was so keen to try and get them to take part. That's what always happens when we have a hearing on human rights in a country. We invite the country's diplomatic representatives to speak to us, making certain that this be as open and democratic as we can. But they didn't wish to speak, which is very surprising for members of the committee who know how keen their counterparts from other countries were to take part. When we did Mexico, we're going to have Palestine and Gaza this afternoon, Ukraine. The task of our committee is to analyse, look at and speak out for human rights outside the borders of the European Union. That's the committee's remit. And while that's its remit and while I'm the chairman, that's what we're going to be doing. Well, thanks for that explanation, says Mr. Coso. I didn't mean to be disrespectful, I just thought there was a discrepancy. Okay, says the chairman. Mr. Faria. Thanks very much, Madam Chairman. First of all, I'd like to find out which TV Mr. Coso watches, which radio he listens to. It sounds like suddenly it's broadcasting Soviet-style propaganda. Anyway. That's a question that demonstrates a lack of respect, says Mr. Coso. Anyway. What we need to do is to have unbiased news, and I wasn't. You are the person who is lacking in respect, not me. I'd like to say thank you to Mr. Aveledo, to Mr. Otero, Mrs. Bittencourt, and the other members of the panel. And to my friend Ramon, I'm from the ALDE group, the Liberal group. And that someone mentioned the group, and so it's good that that happened. We've got people representing the people of Venezuela. They're often risking their own personal safety to do so. And I'd like to thank them for that. These are brave people, these are courageous people, and they deserve our respect. I'd like to thank them publicly. I don't know whether I would be brave enough to come here, but these ladies and gentlemen are, and I thank them again. I'm not going to make a long speech about declaration of intentions. That's already been done. This has become very politicised already. I just wanted, therefore, to look at the issue of impunity, arbitrary arrests, the failure to separate the justice system from the political system, and various problems such as that. I'm concerned, and we're all concerned in Europe, I think, not just with those aspects, human rights, the right of freedom of expression, right of access to information, which my colleague talks about as well, but we're concerned in particular about the safety of people, their personal safety. I'm from Portugal, as is my colleague from Eurolat. We do have a large Portuguese community in Venezuela, as he said, and they feel that they are one of the foreign communities that suffered most, because they were looking for a country where they could live, where they could prosper, where they could help build a successful, happy country. And they've been killed, they've been kidnapped, they've had their property expropriated. These people deserve our support. We meet in Europe to show our trust in them, and we need to come out with measures which might be tougher than we've used so far, trying to force the Venezuelan government to respect human dignity. That's basically what I wanted to say. I would like to ask more questions, because we do have representatives of the opposition here. What does the Venezuelan opposition need to do to unite? Can we be certain that in the next election there will be a genuine alternative to the Maduro government? Is the opposition united? In other words, do you have the single objective to remove from power this man who doesn't deserve to be there? And the other side is largely represented by the famous 30 families that tend to run the country. How can we help from Europe when Latin America is divided and isn't providing the support? Somebody mentioned the Eurolat summit, various other meetings. We've tried to send a message in the Euro-CELAC meeting, but we couldn't do it because the Latin American side said it was interference and didn't let the resolutions go through. I'd like some feedback on that idea, please. Thank you.
Gracias. La señora Zuber.
Thank you very much, Ms. Suer.
Obrigada, Sr. Presidente. Vou falar em português.
I'll be speaking Portuguese, Madam Chairman. Here, I think there's been some confusion. You've got the legitimate right which we have to look into human rights related issues, and the political selections and options and ideological positions of colleagues. I've looked very carefully at the list of guests which reflect the majority position in the European Parliament when it comes to Venezuela. And there is a possibility of a balance which would reflect more the full makeup of the Parliament. I'm not surprised that it happened like that. But the first speaker from our group or suggested by our group, made some interesting points. And as far as the other speakers are concerned, they moved fairly quickly from facts to stating opinions about how the economy should be run, about inflation, about hunger, things that people have a perfect right to have an opinion about and to express an opinion about, but not terribly relevant to the topic under discussion. Because the fact that we have opinions doesn't mean that it's up to the European Parliament to suggest the political path that Venezuela ought to follow. Surely it's the Venezuelan people that ought to do that, and it has done so in elections in the past. Elections which were monitored by the Jimmy Carter Institute and found to be fair. And the second issue that I wanted to raise is that it's essential that a justice system, a legal system, works. And our group was against Parliament making statements on the subject because, first of all, we thought that this was being used for political ends. These things mysteriously seem to always be raised in a pre-election period. And also, in order for the Venezuelan system to work independently and to work in an efficient way, then what shouldn't happen is the kind of interference that we've been seeing from Europe, going on about the principle of separation between the political system and the legal system. We believe that regional organizations in Latin America and the Caribbean can look after this. We couldn't find a consensus in the last Eurolat meeting because the Latin American side, from various political points of view, didn't agree with the European Parliament's view of Venezuela. So it's not just that it's Venezuela on one side and everybody else on the other. Also, I'm not surprised that the Venezuelans aren't terribly keen on the Inter-American Human Rights Court. And there are various other countries in the region that don't recognise the court or necessarily implement its rulings. So what I wanted to say is that we totally reject attempts to take advantage of this hearing for clearly political ends, to interfere in Venezuela's internal affairs. And it's not a coincidence that we've not heard about it, but there was a coup in 2002, a coup which was backed. You are going to have to come to a conclusion, says the chairman. And there was an attempt to legitimize a government which was recognized by the USA and Spain. In fact, the BBC and Arte did a very good documentary on how the social media managed to alert people to what was really going on.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give the floor to the two guest speakers. First, Ms. Cabrera for her conclusions. Yes. I would like to reply to the questions put to us. Mr. Assis asked whether we've found any response from the judiciary. We've met with the judiciary. We've had meetings and we've followed up on all the cases, and we have obtained sentences in some cases, guilty verdicts. And Ms. Weber, yes, I work for a state organization. I work for the Ministry of Housing. I, on 2 accounts, was the victim of attacks on that institution. My little girl, who is in the creche, was a victim of an attack on that institution. And the fact that I work for government does not mean that I'm not entitled to call for justice and to defend my human rights and those of my daughter, who could have died. She could have died suffocating from the gases that were released on that creche. So working for the government does not mean that I cannot fight to defend human rights. And if you will, I would also like to add something. You talked about the detained students. Somebody said that they were being tortured, that they were ill, that their teeth were falling out. I ask you, Mr. Oscar is here. He lost his hand because an explosive was thrown at him by so-called peaceful students who were then detained. There were people who died. We have civil servants who have bullets lodged next to their spine, and if that bullet moves, then they may become paralyzed. We have another civil servant who was beaten by students, and she was so brutally beaten that she has now become sterile. And we've heard now about these so-called peaceful students who are allegedly being tortured and allegedly were detained arbitrarily. I think we have to be rational, and we also have to look at victims on all sides. And when I speak on behalf of my victims organization called the Continued Coup, in 2003, there were victims back in 2013, and they are also part of our organization. And there was a presidential candidate who lost the election. He disagreed with that result, and he called on his followers. And he called on them to act out their rejection, their anger, their hatred. And this resulted in mobs attacking voting stations, healthcare centers. And some of these opposition leaders' followers they simply ran over with a car 3 children. And so this was a politician who called on his followers to perpetrate violence, ladies and gentlemen.
Cabrera.
Thank you, Ms. Cabrera. Mr. Averedo.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta. Muchas gracias.
Thanks, Madam Chairman. Thanks to the honourable members for the comments and questions. I have the democratic right to express their views in the European Parliament as they would in their national parliaments. But unfortunately in the Venezuelan Parliament, that's not the case. In the Venezuelan Parliament, the Speaker thinks that he owns the Parliament and decides who will speak and who won't, and insults members. Some of them have been indeed excluded simply for expressing their own political opinions, without there having been any kind of debate in the Parliament, without there being a vote on whether the person should be expelled or not. And I say this with the utmost respect. When a political ideology thinks that it's scientifically valid, they mistake their opinions for facts, and it's obviously politically quite useful because you genuinely believe that because you believe something, that thing is right, and you have an intrinsic source of truth. That's not true, of course. Various things have been said, and I'll try to keep this as brief as possible, and of course speaking in a fully respectful tone. First of all, we are in favour of a Venezuela where all Venezuelans can live together and live without discrimination, without exclusion, without any kind of difference. The violence over the last few years is wrong, no matter who carried it out. Of course, there have been problems in the legal systems in trying people, in dealing with it, because the institutions, the public prosecutor, the legal system in general are totally dominated by one particular mindset as far as politics is concerned. The Venezuelan constitution says that judges should be chosen by open competition, but that's not happening in Venezuela. The constitution says there should be a qualified majority in electing members of the Supreme Court and the chief prosecutor and the ombudsman. But again, they were elected in a different way by absolute majority. And you often see them accompanying the President of the Republic in various public events. And the representative of the Guarimba Victims Committee has explained how these other committees are just totally dominated by the national government. How can there be justice for all, which is what we want? How can that happen if the government dominating everything? How can we have genuine justice? There's a justice deficit in Venezuela. There's a very serious lack of confidence in the system, and that's very serious for all of us. And the government likes to say that Venezuela's changed irrevocably and that it's altered things for the better in a permanent way, but no, we know that's not the case. No majority is eternal and no minority is destined to be a minority forever.
Absolutamente.
Yes, I totally agree with that, but no one can understand what you say if you speak without having had the floor. If you want to ask for the floor for a minute, then you can do so. I apologise, but we feel completely impotent because of what we've heard this afternoon. Please. That's what we are in favour of putting right. The microphone's unfortunately gone off for this. Oh, it's come back on again. We need to sort things out through the ballot box. And it can't be a good thing if we have a vote and I win, and it's not a bad thing if we have a vote and I lose. But all need to respect the results of these elections. The Venezuelan government says it's unacceptable that the European Parliament expresses an opinion, and it regards it as interference. But it doesn't say, it doesn't complain, of course, when another parliament comes out in favour of the Venezuelan government. In fact, they make a big fuss about it for their propaganda. So, the Uruguayan Senate, for example, the Uruguayan Senate, listen to this, and the Colombian House of Representatives, the Peruvian Congress, both houses of the Chilean Parliament, the Brazilian Senate, the National Assembly of Costa Rica, all of these parliaments have raised the same issues as you, more or less exactly the same. But once again they were greeted with silence because it's tantamount to the kind of what they call European colonial interference. They don't understand the concept of universal values that are accepted everywhere. And only a few countries are now closing themselves off and trying to keep power in the hands of a few in perpetuity. That's something the Venezuelan government doesn't seem to understand. For example, Mr. Coso was surprised that I talked to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Look, it was the fruit of a treaty. Its headquarters was decided on by a treaty. And the American Human Rights Convention set up the court, and all Latin American countries are members, and Uruguay withdrew. And why didn't they withdraw? Why didn't Chile withdraw? Why didn't that happen? If it's a US instrument, why didn't they express their objections by leaving? Are they just satellite countries? No. They have expressed criticisms of the government, as did the Venezuelan government. And Venezuela has never been a country that's been subject to the whims of the USA, even when it was governments that I liked more than the one we've got at the moment. I'm certain that when President Leone in the Punta del Este summit asked for the Americans to invade the Dominican Republic, he did it in such a serious way that Lyndon Johnson actually didn't say, well, why don't you keep quiet? So the situation with NGOs and the government now. You've listened to representatives of NGOs this afternoon. Each of them have expressed their own views. Mr. Alvarado from Provea expressed his view, and he was extremely objective. He emphasised issues I probably wouldn't have emphasised myself. But he's someone who's fought for human rights for his whole life, pre-98 and post-98. Everyone's got a right to express their opinion. And everyone has got their own ways of measuring the level of agreement they have with somebody else. I remember a film, Z, by Costa Gavras, where Yves Montand was the star. And I remember that you couldn't see it in Spain when it came out. I don't think you could have seen it in Portugal because it would have been censored. And in Venezuela, there were large numbers of people who'd been exiled from Spain, who'd been exiled from Portugal. And Mr. Jauregui mentioned Fernando de los Rios, who was exiled to Venezuela. And we had him, we had Manuel García Pelayo, all these famous people, Augusto Pisonier, all these famous people who came to Venezuela, all these extremely talented people who did a great deal of good. So, when some US bodies give figures about the success of the battle against poverty, we agree that CEPAL, FAO, these are basically backed by the US, but these will have to be updated. And it seems now that, as has happened, the purchasing power of the poorest people, and now that has gone backwards because of the galloping inflation and the reduction of social benefits. Now, levels of poverty are rising again. And CEPAL has said there's going to be more poor people than there were 15 years ago. That's a terrible situation, of course. And when the US says some things that we can use for our arguments, we think it's great, but when the Committee Against Torture or the group on arbitrary arrests says that there is torture or arbitrary arrest, then we don't have a right to ignore that because we don't agree with it.
Me llama la atención que...
Remember that this idea that it's an interference with Venezuelan sovereignty, that's what the government says when people outside talk about these issues. When they talk about the situation in Venezuela, they say, oh, that's interference. We are sovereign. When I was an MP and tried to get debates going on the human rights situation in Chile or Cuba. That's the same kind of thing that they said. It's a dream of dictatorships. And it's something we've got over now, this idea of criticism being the same as interference. Mr. Farias asked a question about unity in the opposition. We are united in wanting to see a peaceful, democratic, constitutional, electoral change in government. And what we want to do is simply see the present 1999 Constitution respected and applied. Despite our differences of opinion, we're united in that. We are united as far as the elections are concerned, and when people vote, which is the only road that we follow, the road of the popular vote, if we do govern, we will govern with respect for all and with respect to the Constitution. Thank you.
Gracias, señora Veledo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Aveledo, and thank you all for your attention. Venezuela will continue to be a concern of ours, and we'll continue to monitor the situation there. Thank you very much.